As Joe said, my name is Philip, and I lead Foster the City. And Foster the City started about 8.5 years ago. We started rallying churches like Eden, connecting with great pastors like Daniel and Kayla Atondo. And we started linking arms together with churches around the area to move towards kids and families in crisis. And what started 8.5 years ago with churches like Eden, right here in Santa Clara County. We actually started with one little church in meeting in a senior center in San Jose. Today is 302 churches now working together. Isn't that awesome? It's because of killer leaders like Daniel and churches like this that are saying yes, saying, gosh, what can we do to move towards kids in crisis together? It's been super fun to be a part of. I want to take a minute to actually honor those of you who have been a part of it in some way. Some of you have fostered, some of you have supported foster families. Some of you have been, advocates here at the church, ministry leaders. Others of you you've been giving generously to Eden. I want you to know that Eden actually generously supports the work of Foster the City. So as you're giving, I didn't even tell Daniel I was going to say this, by the way. As you're giving towards Eden, I want you to know that your generosity is linked to the lives of vulnerable kids. And that's something we're celebrating, so I want to honor you. I'm going to let you behind the curtain for just a minute, if I could. When we started Foster the City 8.5 years ago, for a few days, don't judge me, but for a few days, I thought we were pioneers. I thought we had come up with something that had never been done before. We were innovative and whatever. And then it lasted 3 days, because then I went on Google, and then I realized, oh gosh, this is actually, there are movements like Foster the City happening all over the country, where churches are coming together and they're linking arms and moving towards kids in crisis and families in crisis. It's happening in Texas and in Florida and in Georgia and Colorado and Oklahoma, all over the place, Arkansas. And so that did a couple things for me. Number one, obviously it humbled me a little bit. I realized maybe I'm not quite as innovative as I thought I was. But number two, what it did was it lit me up. Because I started to think, man, it seems as if the Holy Spirit is doing something in his people. He's reawakening our hearts for kids in crisis and families in crisis, vulnerable in our community. He's stirring something up in the spirit of his church all over the country. And how cool is it that we get to be a part of that right here in California? Isn't that cool? So we were not the pioneers. That said, there was a pioneer. Can I tell you about him? Okay. His name is Bishop Blake. I got a picture of him right here. This is Bishop Aaron Blake. Bishop Blake was a pastor in a tiny little town in West Texas called Brownwood, Texas, in Brown County. And Bishop Blake pastored this tiny little congregation. He was bivocational, though he was also the at-risk counselor at his local high school. And he was the kind of counselor that would have people come in and out of his office all throughout the week, just kids needing to talk. And one of those kids was a boy named Melvin Johnson. And Melvin Johnson was on the high school football team, and he was in the foster care system. And one day, Melvin made his way into Bishop Blake's office, tears streaming down his face, because he had what, in the foster care world, he had another failed placement, which basically means he was getting bumped from the home he was in to yet another foster home, and he was heartbroken. It happened many times over in his young life. And so he's just crying in Bishop Blake's office. And Bishop Blake knew nothing about foster care, didn't know what to say to encourage him, just was Melvin, I'm so sorry. Melvin, I'm so sorry. Oh, if there's anything I could do, Melvin, I'm so sorry. You're such a great kid. Anybody would be lucky to have you. I'd take care of you. You're such a great kid. And then Melvin's wait, you would help a kid like me? Oh, of course, Melvin, of course. Anybody would be lucky to have you. I'm so sorry this happened. So Melvin wiped the tears from his eyes and went on with his day, and Bishop Blake went on with his day. And you probably have a feeling where this is going, right? So not long after that, Bishop Blake got a phone call from a social worker and said, hey, Bishop Blake, I'm here with a boy named Melvin, and he said that you said that you want him to come stay with you. And Bishop Blake kind of stuttered and stammered, and he's I'm going to need to talk to my wife about that. And so he went home to his wife, Mary, and he told Mary what happened, told her about Melvin. And after he explained the story and said what the social worker asked him, he just kind of paused and waited. And you know what she said? She said, Aaron, I sure hope you told them yes. And so yeah, it's awesome, right? So they brought Melvin into their home. Not long after that, the tight end on the football team needed a new foster placement. And Melvin said, it's okay, you can come stay with us at the Blakes. So they brought in the tight end. And then the fullback needed a placement. And then the other fullback needed a placement. And then the defensive back needed a placement. They ended up with 6 high school boys in their home. And listen, every time that one of these boys would come into the Blake household, before they would walk through the door, Bishop Blake would stand out with them on the sidewalk, and he would point at the door, and he'd say, listen, when you walk through that door, you're a part of our family. For however long you need. You are a part of our family. What he said was this. He said, you are engrafted into our family. And he said, I'm going to love you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to care for you as if you are my own flesh and blood. You are being engrafted into this family when you walk through that door. And then the boy would go walk to the door. And that wasn't just like some sweet sentiment. That was something that was tested and tried in all kinds of ways, small ways, big ways. Including the night when one of the boys, middle of the night, was in his room and he was playing with matches. And he accidentally set his curtain on fire. And within a matter of minutes, the entire Blake family was standing out on the sidewalk watching their house burn to the ground. Bishop Blake, who's become a kind of a mentor and a friend of Foster the City, when he told us this story, he said that as he was standing on the sidewalk watching his house literally burn to the ground, all he could think about was his wife who was standing next to him. And just thinking, oh my gosh, what did I ask my wife to do? Is she regretting saying yes to these boys? What is going through her mind right now? But as the firefighters left the scene, Mary simply looked over to her husband and she said, well, we better get to the store. The boys have school in the morning. They're going to need some school supplies. So he said they found themselves in Walmart walking up and down the aisles at 2 a.m. looking for school supplies and a change of clothes for the boys. But here's what gets interesting. The next day, the boys didn't actually go to school. They cut class. Because they were so convinced that just like in times past, a social worker was going to show up and tell them that they had another failed placement. Right? Because, they burnt the house down. Surely they'd crossed the line that time. But it wasn't the social worker that went and found the boys who were hiding. They were hiding in the gymnasium. It was Bishop Blake who went and found them. Bishop Blake brought him back to the hotel where they were now staying, and he was he sat him down and he said, guys, I told you, you are engrafted into our family and nothing was going to change that. And that night, they had kind of an informal adoption ceremony for those boys in the hotel room. Still probably smelling like smoke from the house that they burnt down. What's cool is that this story doesn't end right there, because I told you he was not just the at-risk counselor, he wasn't just a foster dad, he was also a pastor of a church. And now he'd come into contact with the fact that there were kids in his community that needed love and stability and safety and care, just like Melvin. And his heart was breaking. And so one Sunday morning, he stood up in front of his congregation and he said, guys, there are more children entering into foster care today than there are families ready to receive them. This is not okay. This is not how it should be. And he said, this is the question he asked them. He said, who will stand with us for the vulnerable? Who will stand with us for the vulnerable? And you know what? Someone did. A woman in his congregation that Sunday morning stood up and she said, I will, Bishop. And then another person stood up and she said, I will. From that tiny little congregation, 15 new foster families stood up, and within a matter of months, there were 39 children in the foster care system in their tiny little congregation. And what was happening in his little church started to actually catch fire with churches around the area. And others said, hey, we want to be a part of this too. We want to start inviting our congregation to do the same. And so they started rallying foster families. And in 2004, they got to the place where there was literally more than enough families. They had a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of kids. Isn't that incredible? And they worked year after year after year to make sure it stayed that way. You know what I love about the story of Bishop Blake? I just made it all up. I'm just kidding. I didn't. It's all true. I'm not sure why I said that. No, that's all true. Is this getting too serious in here? No. You know what I love about that? Because it is a true story. Like that, it is true. It's possible. Like what we're doing is possible. Like this doesn't just have to be a story that we tell that happened halfway across the country. It can be right here. It can be our story too. Bishop Blake came into contact with a boy named Melvin, and his heart broke. And his compassion and his concern led him to action to do something. And when things got hard, he stuck with it. They persevered by the grace of God. When I was praying about our time here together today, last couple weeks, I wrote something down that I want us to lean into. This is my prayer for us today. My prayer for you, my prayer for me. That each of us would have wet eyes, swift feet, and steady hands. Wet eyes, swift feet, and steady hands. I'll explain it if you stay with me. And to do that, I want to look together at a story in the Old Testament. Throughout the summer here at Eden, we're looking at stories and characters from the Old Testament in hopes that these lessons might actually help to shape us into the people and into the community that God is calling us to be. And so to do that today, I want to look at the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, you can turn, if you have a Bible, you can open it. Otherwise, just follow along here on the screen. Let me give you a snapshot of Nehemiah's story. And I think Nehemiah's story actually kind of parallels Bishop Blake's story. It's one of the reasons I want to look at it today. Nehemiah lived about 400 years before Jesus. At this point in history, the Jewish people were living in exile in Babylon. Okay, actually the Persians were in control at the time. Nehemiah was actually one of the servants to the Persian king. If you remember your biblical history, some of you who've been a part of church, you'll know that years earlier, the Babylonian army had come and defeated the Jewish people, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and then led the Jewish people into exile. They carried off almost everybody. They only left behind in the city of Jerusalem the weak and the vulnerable and the marginalized. They left the orphan and the widows and the elderly and the crippled and the poor. That's who they left behind in the city. And they took off everybody else. So now the town was in rubble. Nehemiah, like I said, is a servant to the Persian king. And one day, a brother of Nehemiah actually comes to Babylon and tells Nehemiah about the state of Jerusalem, about how the city is an absolute ruin. It's in rubble. The walls are broken down, he says, and the few that are left in the city are completely vulnerable. They have no protection, no walls to protect them from those who would come in to try to take advantage of them. So now, listen, instead of Jerusalem being the place that it was set apart to be, a place where you could come and experience the glory of God and the shalom, like the peace of God. Instead, Jerusalem was a place in rubbles and a place where broken, vulnerable people were languishing. It was a broken place where broken people languished, and this broke Nehemiah's heart. So he galvanizes some of the people. They go back to Jerusalem with the blessing of the king. They go back to Jerusalem and they rebuild the city walls against all kinds of pressure and resistance. And in many ways, by doing this, kind of helped to restore the identity and the hope and the faith of the Jewish people. Okay, so that's kind of a 30,000 snapshot, 30,000 foot view. Let's look just a couple little pieces in the story that I think really apply to where we are today in the 21st century. So Nehemiah chapter 1 starts like this. Hanani, one of my brothers, this is Nehemiah talking. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Listen to this. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. And we're going to pause here for a second because this is really important. I'm actually going to, if you'll indulge me, I actually want to talk specifically to the men in the room for a minute, and the men, those of you watching online. Let me ask the guys here a question. When was the last time that you cried? When was the last time you cried? Like, what was it that brought you to tears? Like, maybe it was something beautiful, maybe one of your kids, or a great movie, or something out in nature, maybe something beautiful. Maybe it was something broken, maybe something that you were grieving, some loss, some brokenness around you. Maybe it was nothing because you can't even remember the last time that you cried. When was the last time you cried? John Tyson is a pastor and an author in New York City. He recently shared about a survey that he did where he asked the question, what are the biggest issues that men struggle with in the world today? Men in particular, what are the biggest issues that men struggle with in our world today? And he got all kinds of answers that you would probably assume, porn and loneliness and identity and immaturity and these things. He said, but I also got this response, like this category of responses that I was completely shocked about. And the category was this: emotional numbness. Emotional numbness. He said that men noted an inability to feel. Women talked about this, how they noticed a deadness in men's hearts. This is what he went on to write. He said, life can grind a man's heart out. It can weaken and callous and wound and numb. We can just go through the motions so often that slowly our hearts shrivel, atrophy, survive. But we can also choose to position our hearts at the places where they come alive, the places of beauty and brokenness, sorrow and joy. Paul tells us in Romans 12, we're to rejoice with those who rejoice, and we weep with those who weep. Men, we have to choose, we have to choose to enter into the places where tears are the only appropriate response. And if we're willing to do that, if we move towards the tears, this is where we find Jesus. Because throughout the life of Jesus, we find him just breaking down emotionally as he comes into contact with brokenness. The death of a friend, right? Looking over a city whose hearts had just grown hard and unrepentant, a city that was far from God, and it broke his heart. What if we looked at Campbell in the same way? John Tyson goes on to write, he said, Jesus wept is the shortest verse in the Bible, and yet it may be the most profound. Here is a God with sacred tears on his cheeks. Being a disciple includes asking Jesus to teach us the way of tears. Please listen to this. Push back on the trivial distractions that rob you of your capacity to love. May God have mercy on our dry eyes. May rivers of tears flow again. Again, go back to the story of Nehemiah. For 70 years, Jerusalem lay in ruins. For 70 years, the marginalized and the vulnerable languished in the city, but nobody did anything for 70 years. They had gotten used to something that they shouldn't be used to. May that not be true of us. They had gotten used to something that they shouldn't be used to. And finally, here was a man that said, this is not the way it should be, and I'm going to do something about it. This is what I wrote down. Please hear me. Our generation does not need men with more charisma or confidence or capacity. Our generation just needs men who care. It needs men with tears in their eyes. May God give us wet eyes. My first prayer is just that we would have wet eyes. Or as Albert Camus, the philosopher, said, a life worth living is a life lived to the point of tears. So the first is that we'd have wet eyes, that we'd be a people that care. about what we see in front of us. But secondly, that wouldn't just stop there, that we'd have swift feet, that our compassion, just like Bishop Blake, that our compassion would lead us to act. Jackie Pullinger said it like this: God wants us to have soft hearts and hard feet. The trouble with so many of us is that we have hard hearts and soft feet. That'll preach. Look at how this plays out in Nehemiah. Nehemiah goes to the people and says this. He says, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. I love that. Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. They replied at once, yes, let's rebuild this wall. And so they began the good work. I want to just highlight a couple phrases here that he says. First, he says, again, let's end this disgrace. What is it in or around you that is not the way it should be? A lingering, maybe sin in your life, or it could be a root of bitterness, something you're holding against someone. It could be some bit of injustice within your reach. Listen, I don't want to call normal what God is weeping over. I don't want to call normal in my life or around me what God is weeping over, what breaks the heart of God. He's looking for a man or a woman who would say, this is not the way that it was meant to be, and I'm going to do something about it. That's one of the reasons why I really see being a part of Foster City as one of the greatest gifts of my life. Because I've watched over 300 churches, pastors, and countless families who have looked at the needs of vulnerable children in their community and said, enough is enough. Let's end this disgrace. These children should not be without family. And they did something about it. Can I tell you how that all started? So in 2014, my wife and I started attending a foster care orientation here in Santa Clara County. My parents fostered when I was growing up, so I had foster brothers and sisters in and out of the home, and so that was a really challenging thing to grow up with as a kid, but it was also really inspiring. I just watched my parents love and grind for these kids, and I just thought, man, I want to do that someday. I want that to be part of my story. And so in 2014, my wife and I started attending classes, getting trained to be foster parents. And I heard stories that I still think about to this day, 10 years later. Heartbreaking stories of kids in our community. I heard stories about girls who were abused over and over and over. I heard about babies that were being born with just drugs pumping through their systems. I heard about just these stories of severe neglect. I heard about, I'm sorry for being so graphic, but I heard a story about a toddler who would reach down the back of his pants and would eat his feces because he was so hungry. That's not in some other part of the world. That's in Santa Clara County. I heard things that I can never unhear again. I learned things that I can never unlearn. I heard about kids who were being placed into the foster care system but were living for weeks or months at a time in a basement in a building in downtown San Jose because it can't find any place to send these kids. This is not the way it should be. Let's end this disgrace. 2,500 years ago, the vulnerable people in Jerusalem were languishing and they needed help. Nehemiah said, enough is enough. We can do the same thing here. We can do, just like Bishop Blake, we can do the same thing now in our city. Just like Bishop Blake, just like another W.C. Martin, another pastor from Texas. Let me tell you his story for a minute. W.C. Martin was a pastor of a little church, this time in eastern Texas. And one day he stood in front of his congregation and he said, guys, every Sunday we come here and we preach about the compassion of God. And we sing about the grace and the compassion of God. Meanwhile, there are children in our community that are languishing without family. When we come and we sing these songs and not do anything out there with these kids, it's noise is all it is. It is noise. And so together, their congregation developed a heart for vulnerable kids in their community. And together, for this little congregation, they adopted every single child that needed adopting within a 100-mile radius of the church. Isn't that incredible? Listen, they just made a movie about this. It's called Sound of Hope. And so it just left theaters. I wish I was here a week earlier. I could have told you to go see it. When it starts streaming, and it will, take the time to watch this movie. But listen, I don't just want to watch a movie about this, right? We can't just be content in watching and hearing stories about other people doing it. Why not here? Why not now? Let me share with you a story of a friend of mine. His name is Ryan. He had this moment in his life where he said, man, I'm not just going to care about kids. I'm actually going to start doing something about it. I want to share with you a little bit of his story. This is my friend Ryan. This is the moment in time where he decided to actually move from having wet eyes to actually having swift, hard feet. Go ahead and watch this video.
I want to take a minute to tell you the story of how my wife led our family into foster care. Growing up, I had no aspirations to be an adoptive dad or a foster parent. To tell you the truth, I didn't even know what foster care was. My wife, on the other hand, had decided that she was going to adopt a child before she entered middle school. I still remember the day that she came to me and she asked me, what do you think about becoming foster parents? At first, I was very hesitant about the idea. I was not interested in signing up right away to welcome children into our life from hard places. And I think one of the main reasons is I couldn't wrap my head around the concept of pouring myself out for a child only to have them leave our home. Yet after a while and her persistence, I agreed to go to an orientation to learn more about what fostering was all about. And I remember at the orientation, they shared stories and statistics of kids who were in care. Some of those statistics really cut straight to my heart. Shortly after, we found out about a 23-year-old who needed a place to stay. And my wife, yet again, convinced me that we should open up our home to this young man. As we heard his story and got to know him, we found out some heartbreaking details about his journey into foster care. When he was 14 years old, he was part of this horrific event that resulted in his entire family dying except for him. He was the only one who survived. And that event led him to enter into foster care. And the thing about his story that made me the most angry, that broke my heart the most, is that this boy at 14 years old, after going through one of the worst things I can imagine, being in foster care, there was no family available to take care of him. He ended up staying in a group home for his entire adolescence. I remember one day sitting with him. We were actually driving in the car. I know exactly the street we were on, and I asked him about why he played so many video games. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, well, I don't really like this world. And when I play video games, I'm taken to a place where nobody can hurt me. Hearing those words in that moment, all of my hesitation about becoming a foster parent melted away, and I was left sitting with a little boy who needed a home. The truth is, I'm not alone in my hesitation to become a foster dad. Many husbands are hesitant to follow their wives' calling to foster children. Addressing this issue, author and foster parent Jason Johnson says this: some will say it's important that both the husband and wife feel called, and I would wholeheartedly agree. That is, after all, the point. Perhaps God is making that call very clear to you through your wife. The truth is that there are many husbands who are hesitant to follow their wives leading into foster care. And this is really tragic because the need for godly men to step into these children's lives is massive. One national study found that 46% of children involved in the foster care system had not seen their fathers in the last year. Yet study after study suggests that children with involved, loving fathers are significantly more likely to do well in school, to have healthy self-esteem, to exhibit empathy, even to avoid high-risk behaviors like drug use and criminal activity. Foster dads have a unique opportunity to be present and committed to children who need fathering, and in doing so, they can make a significant difference in that child's life. Most of the children I've fostered have moved on from my home, but I am so grateful that at such a crucial and vulnerable time in their life, God allowed me to play a role in making sure that these children knew how much God loved them. To find out how you can make a difference in a child's life, head to fosterthecity.org and sign up to attend an interest meeting today.
I just realized we're kind of coming down on the dads today, on the men today. Is that all right? Maybe see it less as like a rebuke and more of like, what's possible? Gosh, what's possible if we would say yes? There are hundreds of kids in the foster care system in Santa Clara County today, guys, but listen, there's over 500 churches in Santa Clara County. If even a fraction of churches would raise up one new foster family, we would have more than enough. We'd have a waiting list. And just like W.C. Martin, just like Bishop Blake, like it's possible. So in Nehemiah 2, it says that they began the good work. What is the good work to which God is calling you? What is the good work to which God is calling you? Maybe it has nothing to do with foster care. Foster care is but one expression of compassion. I'm passionate about it, so I'm going to lean into it. But what is the good work that he's calling you to? Maybe it is Foster the City. Maybe it's getting involved right here at Eden. Maybe what God needs to do is stir up your spirit, break your heart once again for the greater Campbell area, this part of the Bay Area, for those who are far from him. Maybe this is the invitation for you to jump into what's happening here at Eden. Get on the front line, start serving, start giving. Be a more of an active part of this community and reach this area with the message of Jesus. We need wet eyes. We need swift, hard feet, a willingness to do something. And then finally, we need steady hands. In other words, we need a steady resolve. Because a few things happen when we begin the good work. When we let our eyes lead to swift feet, a few things happen. And we need steady hands. We see this with Nehemiah. First, they experience resistance. When Nehemiah and the others come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and to rebuild the city, there were some people in the surrounding areas that weren't too happy about that. They'd gotten used to being able to exploit what was happening in Jerusalem, these people. So they weren't happy about it, and so they began to discourage Nehemiah and the others. They tried to stop them. They actually tried to hire lawyers against them. They complained to the king about them. They actually at one point came armed and threatened them. It got to this place where Nehemiah and the others who were rebuilding actually had to rebuild with one hand and hold a sword in the other. I heard somebody say once that when you're on mission, you know you're flying over the right target when you start to get shot at. And that's what was happening with Nehemiah. And that's what happens with us. When we move towards brokenness, there will always be a cost involved. The question that comes to our minds, for most of us, if we're honest, when we see somebody in need, whether it's somebody on the street corner, whether it's our friend whose marriage is falling apart and needs some emotional support, or if it's a kid in foster care, when we see somebody in need, internally we often do like a cost analysis. Like, what is this going to cost me if I move towards this person? How will this impact my time? How much time is this going to take me? What will this do for me financially? How will this impact my sense of safety and security and ambitions and my plans and my goals? When we talk with folks about foster care, these are the very concerns we hear. What if the kids that come into our home, what if they misbehave? Like they've gone through some pretty hard things, they've walked through some trauma. What if they come into our home and they act out of that trauma? Isn't that hard? It can be. What if the kids come into our home and like Ryan said, what if I get too attached? We hear that one all the time. What if I get too attached? That's the point. That's exactly what the kids need from you, is for you to get too attached, for you to love them to that degree. Doing foster care, saying yes to foster care has easily been one of the greatest decisions we've ever made. It's also one of the hardest decisions we've ever made. There will always be a cost involved. My friend says foster care is beautiful, but it's also brutal. She calls it brutiful. I think that's a good way to say that. But listen, my friend Jason says you don't foster to get a child for your family. You foster to give your family to a child. You see that? And that's true with any expression of compassion, right? We don't move towards hard things to get something for ourselves, like to feel good about ourselves at the end of the day, or to get a nice feeling when we put our head down on the pillow, right? It's not about us. There will always be a cost involved. But surely our life was meant to be more than just getting to the finish line as safe and as comfortable as possible. Amen? Another thing we might experience, though, is not just resistance, but also insecurity. We might think to ourselves, yeah, I'd love to do something significant with my life. Like, what could I possibly do? Like, who am I to do something meaningful like that? But this is one of the reasons I love this story of Nehemiah, is because you get to this list in chapter 3 of all the people that actually carry out this great work and rebuild the city and provide protection for the vulnerable. And I'm not going to read the list of names because I'll butcher all the names, but at some point just scan through that list and you'll see the names of the people and the titles of the people. Here's what you won't find. You won't find one professional wall builder. You won't find one stonemason. What you will find is you'll find men and women, young, old, sons, daughters, clergy, business leaders, noblemen. You'll see slaves. You'll see Jews. You'll see foreigners, leaders, servants, all working side by side. Not one single solitary professional wall builder. Not everyone does the same thing. You'll see that as you kind of read through it, like some people did this like massive stretch of the wall. Others did just what was, they were only able to do what was right in front of their home. Not everyone can do the same thing, but everybody does something. I love that. If you go back to Nehemiah 2 in verse 18, it says, the people say, "Let us rebuild the wall." They began the good work. A lot of biblical scholars actually point this out, that this moment in time actually marks a pretty significant shift in the way that God is working in the world around us. Because up until this point throughout kind of biblical history, you'll see that God typically uses a single solitary leader, a great charismatic leader, to do something significant. So you get like Moses, who helps to deliver the people from Egypt and takes them on towards the promised land. Or you have David, or you had Samuel, or you have Jeremiah, these single leaders. But at this moment in time, something shifts. And it's no longer a single solitary leader doing the work, it's a people. It's a group of people. They began the good work. In fact, if you read through Nehemiah chapter 3, the phrase "next to" is said 28 times. So this guy worked next to this lady who worked next to them, who worked next to them. Next to said 28 times in one chapter alone. If I'm going to translate that here to Eden language, one of your core values here at Eden is mission together. Did you know that? Mission together. And I love the phrase, kind of the corresponding phrase to that value. You say, "We only accomplish the mission when we charge the hill together." That's good. I'm going to take that. I'm going to steal that, I think. We only accomplish the mission when we charge the hill together. God is not just looking for one talented, charismatic, inspired, confident leader. He's looking for a people. For a people. Not everyone can do the same thing, but everybody can do something. What's your something? We've seen this really beautifully kind of play out in Foster the City. For some people, they actually, like Ryan, they actually are called to foster. That might be you today. There's something like close to 40% of Christians, they've done studies, close to 40% of Christians at some point in their life have considered doing foster care. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've actually thought about it in the past. And for whatever reason, you haven't taken a step. You've got questions. You've got concerns. Maybe you just didn't know where to take your first step. If that's you today, I want you to know there's a first step you can take today to learn a little bit more. But for most of us, it's maybe you're not called to foster, but your heart is stirred and you want to do something. I want you to know there's another role to play called a support friend for a foster family. One of the primary reasons why there's a shortage of families today is because families drop out of fostering because it's really, really hard. More than half will drop out within the first year. What changes that is if a family fosters in the context of community. So for every foster family that we raise up, we try to wrap them with at least 4 households that serve as support friends. And these guys, they're providing meals, they're babysitting so the parents can get out and get a date night, right? They're showing up and they're mowing lawns, or they're picking up the laundry and taking care of it and dropping it back off on the porch all folded. My wife and I had a support friend who lived a little distance away from us, but had a little extra resources, so they would send a cleaner to our house every month. It was awesome. It's a support friend just shows up and provides practical, emotional, spiritual support to a family. When you have that, a foster family, more than 90% lasts past a year. Makes a difference. Maybe that's a role you could consider. I'm going to mention one other role, and that's the role of an advocate. In every church we partner with, there's a ministry leader at the church that cares for the families that step forward, that helps to build the Foster City ministry at the local church. We need an advocate here at Eden. When I was driving here today, that's what I was praying for. We need leadership. We need somebody that would help to build this ministry and care for those that are stepping forward. I want you to know we've designed that role in particular for people with very busy lives. So you don't have to have any experience with foster care. You just have to have a heart that cares and a few extra hours a month. Our team would train you and coach you along the way. So if you're interested in any of these roles, your next step's the same. Go to the guest center today, and I'm going to give you a little next step card. I'll have you fill it out, and we'll email you about an interest meeting, the interest meeting that Ryan was talking about. And you can join us on that. It's over Zoom. Does that sound good? Does it sound good? All right. Again, we can't all do the same thing. We can all do something. We can only accomplish the mission when we charge the hill together. So again, when we begin the good work, we might face resistance. We might face insecurities. And then finally, and I close with this, I don't really know how to say this. Potentially a growing apathy. I'll find a better way to say that at some point. Maybe a decreased motivation. And I feel like I just have to mention it here because it happened in Nehemiah's story, and I think it can happen in our story sometimes too. So Nehemiah and the others, they actually rebuilt the wall. They did a phenomenal job in a record amount of time, and they start rebuilding the rest of the city. And what you find out is that eventually their motivation starts to decrease, and they start to actually kind of turn inward. And they start focusing on their own homes, and a lot of the city remains kind of languished in rubbles. And so what happens is God sends a prophet, a guy named Haggai, to actually remind the people to keep going, to not stop, don't give up. And so Haggai is reminding them about the goodness of God and the glory of God and what he's called them to and what's possible if they stay faithful. And miracle upon miracles, the people listen and they get back at it. That doesn't normally happen in the Old Testament. People don't listen to prophets. They actually did with this one. So they got motivated and they got back at it. Haggai, it says, if you read through the book of Haggai, it tells that part of the story, and it just says that God stirred the spirits back up. He stirred up their spirits. So this kind of brings us back to our very first point. Is there anything that you used to weep about, but the tears have dried up? Is there anything that maybe you're now calling normal, or it is what it is, that is breaking the heart of God? I think he wants to stir your spirit back up. I'll invite the band to come back up. I'll finish with this one story, because this happened to me personally. Just recently, I got a chance to go my first ever sabbatical. That's where Daniel and Kayla are today and their family. They're on sabbatical. We'd hit 7 years with Foster the City. And so kind of in our organizational kind of bylaws, whatever, I got a 4-week sabbatical. I was so stoked about it. I'd never had a sabbatical before. So leading into this sabbatical, I was really praying, like, God, would you, I'm not just interested in having a 4-week vacation. I'm not just looking for 4 weeks of rest. I want to, would you use this time of sabbatical to, reawaken in me the vision for what we're doing at Foster the City? I still cared about kids and families in crisis, right? But, it had been 7 years. So I'm like, God, would you just, stoke the fire in my spirit for what we're doing? And so we move into the sabbatical, and the first 3 weeks were awesome. I went on a trip with my family. I got some time alone in the Redwoods. It was fantastic. And then the fourth week came. It was 5 days before Christmas. This was 2 Christmases ago. 5 days before Christmas, I'm in Target. I'm standing in line with two of my kids, with my sons. We were buying some stocking stuffers, kind of last minute. And my wife calls, and she's on the other end of the line. She's screaming. And she said, Philip, the house is on fire. The house is on fire. So I race home, and sure enough, there's 4 fire trucks outside of our home. Everybody's okay. Our house was still standing, but we did lose almost everything. It took us 10 months to be able to get back into our home because of all the damage. But that night that it happened, we got to a hotel with all of our kids and our animals, and I told my wife, I was like, hey, tomorrow, why don't you load the kids up in the car, drive up to Oregon to my folks. The kids don't need to be in a hotel. Like, go up to Oregon. I'll stay back and I'll get things going with insurance. And then in a few days, I'll fly up and I'll join you all. We'll have Christmas together as a family. And she said, okay. What a blessing you are to our family. This is fantastic. What a great man you are. No, she didn't say that. But have you been working out? You look thinner. No, none of that. What she said was, she said, okay. And so you loaded the kids up in the car the next day and she drove up. I stayed back and I got insurance going. And a few days go by, it's Christmas Eve, and I'm supposed to fly up to go be with them for Christmas. And this is, you probably don't remember this, but this is the Christmas when they had like these historic storms pass through parts of the country, and like a historic amount of flights were grounded. There's a whole Southwest debacle, if you remember that. They talk about the atmospheric rivers going over. Basically, my flight was canceled, and there was no way for me to get up to Oregon to be with my family. Not a chance, or for them to get back down to me. So, Christmas Eve, I'm sitting in a hotel room, and if I'm honest, it was like one of the saddest, most like lonely, overwhelming moments of my life. We lost almost everything. Everybody that I loved the most in the world was separated from me. I didn't know what the future was going to hold. I was just completely overwhelmed. And what was interesting was that in that moment, as I'm praying through that moment, like I felt like strongly in my spirit what the Lord was telling me. This doesn't make any sense, but I felt like what he was telling me was, Philip, I don't want you to look on the bright side. I thought, what an interesting thing to like sense from the Lord, but I felt it so strongly. So when people reach out and they say, Philip, how are you doing? I would be honest, but like, honestly, man, this sucks. This is really, really hard right now. I'm scared. I'm feeling really lonely. Like I would just try to acknowledge, like, this is really hard right now. And I didn't really even understand why God would want me to sit in that moment and feel that moment the way that it was. Weeks later, months later, as I was reflecting back on that season, I'm beginning to wonder, perhaps this is what God was doing. Every single day, there are kids that come into the foster care system, and just like I had experienced, they were removed from their home because of some kind of traumatic event. They were separated from the people that they love most in all of the world, and there was no way that they could get back to them. Like, everything that felt safe and secure was ripped away, and like the future is unknown. It feels scary. You feel alone. In that moment, that's what I was feeling. That's what I felt. Now, I'm not saying that what I walked through was the same as foster care. In just a couple weeks later, I was back with my family. But in that moment, that kind of fear and overwhelm and sadness, like I felt it. I asked God to stir my spirit back up for kids who are walking through this, and I felt like he gave me that gift. You know what I did, by the way, that day, that Christmas Eve day, is when I was honestly feeling really sad and alone and scared, I went to church. There were all kinds of Christmas Eve services happening. I actually went to 3 different churches that day. I went from one to the next, because I needed to be in a place where like I knew that people loved me and cared about me. And I needed to be in a place where I could be reminded of what's true, is that we have a God that moves towards us in our need. Even when things feel dark and heavy and scary, we have a God who loves us and will sit with us in that. Who will grieve with us, will give us hope. Listen, when kids enter into the foster care system today, they're probably not going to go to church, but the church can go to them. The church can go to them. And that's what Foster the City is doing. He stirred my spirit back up. Now, he didn't set my house on fire. Can I name that? He didn't. I'm not saying he set my house on fire, and I'm not saying that he's going to set your house on fire. What I am going to say is this, though. He wants to stir up your spirit. He wants you to have wet eyes again. He wants you to care about the things that he cares about. So again, I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Bishop Blake. Who will stand with us for the vulnerable? Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for every person that's here today and watching online. God, I thank you for the legacy of this church already. Just years into the making, God, there's already a significant difference that you are making in this community through Eden Church. God, I pray for more. God, I pray that you would give us wet eyes, that you would break our hearts once again for the things that break your heart. God, I pray that we wouldn't just be content with that, though, just to care. God, you would also help us to act, help us to move, give us hard feet, and then give us a steady resolve, steady hands, God, when things get difficult, to stay the course by the power of your Spirit for the glory of your name. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.